Welcome back to Harbour Unboxed. It is time for part 3 of the April Q&A that almost certainly didn't get released in April, but that's just what happens with part 3. It's tacked on the end there, isn't it, Tim?
Pretty much,
it's when we get to the editing and whatnot. So, yeah, welcome to part 3. But before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and the new Constellation series of ATX cases. The C8 comprises both ARGB and non-ARGB models, with both black and white variants available. The C8 ARGB features a seamless 45-degree beveled glass edge, giving it that popular minimalist design, while also providing a dual chamber for independent cooling. It also comes with a pair of 160mm tranquil reverse ARGB PWM fans and a single 140mm fan with a built-in fan control hub that can be synced directly with your motherboard. The top, bottom and right sides can accommodate a trio of 360mm radiators simultaneously for those who want to ensure ample cooling or just go nuts with their ARGB. Or for those of you who aren't particular fans of RGB effects, there is a non-ARGB version available as well. So, for more information and to check out the rest of Antec's range, please check the link in the video description. Alright, this is a bit of a classic go now or wait type question.
Oh, yep.
So, should you build an AM5 gaming rig now or wait for the new AM5 CPU, so Zen 5, and the new GPUs to launch this fall/winter?
Yeah, on the CPU side, I'd definitely be waiting at this point. We don't know when specifically in the year Zen 5 will be announced, but it seems to be more likely in the next few months than not.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, if we're talking about, I think the most likely time, again, we don't have information on this just yet, but the most likely time that I'd be looking at in the calendar for any announcement would be Computex, which is just around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
So
we will be there.
We will be there.
We will give you all the news.
So, yeah, I would say I would at least be waiting until the next couple of months just to see what announcements are like. What's the vibe like? If we don't see an announcement at Computex, then it's likely to be much later in the year, in which case maybe you would, depending on, the usual, what's your system like now? What should you be doing? How long are you willing to wait? I think GPUs...
It depends.
Yeah, it depends.
Like how desperate are you to upgrade?
100%.
All that kind of stuff, because 6 months of having fun in gaming now, it's hard to put a figure on what that's actually worth to you. And,
yes.
Are you going without right now? Do you have nothing, or can you make do reasonably comfortably? Because if that's the case, then I would suggest keep on making do until it's really obvious what you should do.
That's right. I think with next generation GPUs, that's going to be later than the CPU releases. So it's still unclear whether we're talking end of this year or next year, and that could even depend on the models. I highly doubt that we will see new GeForce mid-range GPUs until 2025. So if that's what you were waiting for, you could be waiting quite a lot longer. Again, we don't know what RDNA4 is bringing either. So yeah, I think if you're looking at doing like a full upgrade to your system where it's CPU, GPU, the whole works, potentially you'd be waiting quite a while, in which case, again, goes back to the it depends situation. But I think specifically for CPU upgrades, I think we'll be learning a lot more about future products within the next couple of months, in which case, at this point, I'd say it's probably worth just waiting to see what's announced, what's the vibe like, and then go from there.
Do you anticipate Blackwell, so that's the next generation GeForce GPUs, probably the GeForce 50 series, and RDNA4, so Radeon 8000 series, to still offer 8GB VRAM as the entry level? I mean, if the entry level drops down to $200 or less, then that would be acceptable, whether I anticipate it or not. Look, I hope after all the effort we've put into this subject and others, and the apparent awareness of gamers now that both AMD and NVIDIA have decided that 8GB of VRAM, even at the entry level, which now happens to be around $300, it's too much money for 8GB of VRAM, and they up it to at least 12. That would be good for the next generation.
It's not going to happen.
No. I've got my fingers crossed that we're going to... Well, look, AMD did release the 7600 XT, and despite some ill-informed people saying that that's a marketing stunt and that's too much VRAM to be utilized by such a GPU, which is completely incorrect, I think we will start to see the benefit of the 16GB 7600 XT in the not-too-distant future over the 8GB model. I mean, you can already show the benefits now The problem with VRAM usage, and I'm sort of going off topic a bit here because I understand that most of our audience gets it, but I've seen people say, oh, I can play Ratchet and Clank just fine on my RTX 2070. What's all this hoo-ha about VRAM? The thing is with Ratchet and Clank, it's one of those games that just deletes your textures. It's just like, here, have muddy ground textures. So you don't notice a performance hit. It can actually improve your performance by not having enough VRAM in that instance. It just doesn't render all of the textures or all of them correctly. And we've seen that in Forspoken. I think Doom's another game that does that. There's a whole list. The majority of games, when you run out of VRAM, they just don't look quite right. And some of the smarter ones will just be some of the textures are missing, while others are rendered at the full resolution. And then you see ones like The Last of Us Part 1, which has been optimized, but still is very heavy on VRAM usage. That will result in very stuttery, terrible performance. So there are a lot more examples of 8 gigabytes of VRAM not being sufficient in 2024. It's just that it manifests itself in different ways. So I'm hoping that being the case, because the next generation entry level should be more powerful, and I suspect will be quite a bit more powerful than an RTX 4060. And then you're getting close to RTX 3070 plus levels of performance. And we already know that that GPU has problems with 8 gigabytes of VRAM. We've had countless 3070 owners tell us that the VRAM thing is a pain in their backside. So
I would be shocked if entry-level GPUs were not 8 gigabytes. I would be shocked if the bottom of the stack, whether that's your 5050 or 5060 or the
I think the most
8600.
If they do the most entry level, like the traditional ones, then I think yes. But I think from $300 up, we will start. Well, from AMD, it makes sense we would, right?
I think that the entry-level GPUs in the next generation will be one 28-bit memory buses, which, if they do go to the next generation of memory, GDDR7, they will, by most reports, there will not be the midpoint memory configuration available at launch. So the only possible configurations will be 8 or 16 gigabytes. In the future, maybe with G7, you'll be able to have 12 gigabytes on 128-bit.
Where there's a lot of assumptions here. Like, we don't know what memory they're actually going to use.
No.
And
No. I'm just assuming 128-bit bus with future memory.
Yeah, it depends on the architecture.
The
memory controller, all that sort of stuff. So
I think what's most likely is that if they were going to increase the memory for the base tiers, that they would offer two configurations. That they'll offer a trash tier 8 gigabyte card, probably overpriced, and then even more overpriced will be the 16 gig version, which hopefully would only cost like $40 or $50 more to get the proper memory spec, but judging by this generation could cost $60, $80, $100 more. So, like, I'd like to sit here and say that yes, these GPUs will have 12 gigabytes or more of memory even for entry-level models, but they should have done that this generation, and they didn't. So,
which makes it more pressing to do it for the next generation.
It makes it more pressing, but like, they seem to just still be content with like, NVIDIA downgraded the 3060 from 12 gig to 8 gig of memory. So, which would never have happened, right?
I'm going to have some hope. I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say we're going to see it.
I think that there will be...
Probably be wrong.
There'll be more VRAM will be available at lower prices, but I still think that the very base models will probably still be 8 gigabytes, and you'll have to pay some premium. And potentially, with all this chat about VRAM this generation, they'll be able to market paying more for more VRAM, so that if they were more 8 and 16 gig differences, they'll be like, well, you've just spent this whole generation complaining about VRAM, so here you go, you can pay for it now. Yeah, hopefully that doesn't happen.
Would you like muddy textures or full HD?
Yeah, pretty much.
Anyway, we'll see what happens.
Do you think it's right for multi-core enhancement to be enabled by default, given that it has made some 14th gen core CPUs unstable? Do you think Intel specifications are to blame, or is it the motherboard manufacturers being too aggressive?
I haven't looked into this too much and the follow-up on these, stability claims. I didn't actually realize MCE was a thing that was still enabled by default, admittedly. I haven't looked at a lot of the LGA 1700 motherboards like I have the AM5 boards, so I haven't had a good look at the default behavior there and what they do. But I wasn't sure if that was it. So maybe I'm a bit out of the loop on that one. But yeah, it's I mean, when we were aware of MCE being enabled by default and it causing all problems with stuff like Cinebench multi-core scores and things like that, yeah, it's difficult to see if it's stable, I guess, okay, but then, it's using more power than it should be and what's stock and it becomes a big mess. But that's been the Intel platform. I don't think there's any one thing like MCE that you can point at to say that's the problem. The motherboard manufacturers have a lot of freedom. And look, I personally don't know at this point in time what the problem is. I don't know if it's Intel's simply pushing this silicon too hard, which they certainly seem to be doing. If you load XMP on most boards, you will see horrendous power usage. You actually have to go and tune that, and then that can have performance-related consequences. So they are being pushed, especially the K-series parts, very hard. They do run very hot. They do use a lot of power. Is the stability caused by silicon degradation? That's what a lot of the reports were pointing to, that it was months down the track of being used aggressively that we started to see these problems, which doesn't really surprise me that would be happening. We've certainly seen that before with overclocked CPUs, things like memory controllers and that starting to fail. I think that's partly what NVIDIA was pointing to as well with their analysis of the situation. But yeah, I really don't have enough facts, and getting the right facts and enough facts with these sort of things is very difficult. You saw the trouble we went through to validate Radeon RX 5700 XT black screen and stability issues. And even when I did find those, I was able to fix them using various different means, whether it's, a higher quality DisplayPort cable or something like that. And it affected different AIB models in different ways. The AM5 burning up the CPU problem that was mostly ASUS boards, it was my understanding, but again, it's not a problem we were able to replicate or ever saw in our testing. So whenever you come up against these stability things, they're a nightmare. And a lot of people in the audience don't actually understand this, or at least a lot of the people that comment, because they say, well, my 13700K is rock solid, so there's definitely no problems. I'm like, I wish, and I bet you Intel and AMD and NVIDIA wish it was that simple. There's so many factors at play. Again, it could simply be the motherboards and how they work. It could be something to do with silicon quality and the lower quality chips aren't handling it. It could be that the higher quality chips having the problems because they're actually running faster and seeing more degradation. It's hard to say what the problem is. It's very difficult to the bottom of it. All we know is a lot of Intel users are having stability problems, which was actually news to me when this came out because my LJ 1700 systems have been pretty stable. I have had my gaming system crash, like black screen and reset from time to time, but I wasn't about to go out and say this is an Intel CPU problem, because it could be the power supply, it could be the memory, it could be the motherboard, it could be simply something that's addressable by a firmware update. So nailing down that sort of stuff is really difficult. So I guess I just wanted to get that disclaimer out of the way before we even talk about this, because we don't know what the problem is. I don't think Intel knows what the problem is, but it is important to point out that Intel's investigating the problem, what's causing it. So whether it's motherboards with MCE. But I guess one problem that we would like to highlight, that we have been highlighting for years now, is that regardless of what is causing this, one big problem that could be causing this, and in a roundabout way has to be to blame to some degree, is Intel's lack of a power spec, or at least not a lack of, it's very loosely defined. The CPU can be running in so many different configurations that are so wildly different, and nobody knows what stock is. So some people will say, all you do is you undervolt and that fixes the problem. Well, that's not an Intel spec. Or you run at the Intel failsafe spec. It's like, well, that's a fail-safe spec. I don't know if you ideally want to be running in that. And that's certainly not how Intel presents their CPUs to media. They present their CPUs to media running XMP, with a lot of the time PL1 equaling PL2. And they even had that in their marketing material, that's now how they're... So what is it?
I mean, that factors into the performance side of things, right? Because they want the CPUs to be running at the highest possible allowed spec, because that pushes them up in the benchmark charts. It allows them to market things a bit better. And yeah, it is always funny you bring up the XMP stuff about how there's some people who get very annoyed that stock testing is with XMP enabled. And they're always talking about, that's not technically stock because XMP is effectively overclocking the memory, and yet Intel themselves, when they're marketing their CPUs, are using features like XMP in their marketing materials to reduce the margins between them and their competitors, right? So,
and it's a fair enough point, because technically the person who's saying that is technically correct.
They are technically correct, but also it's like Intel themselves don't even acknowledge that they're running
that's right.
non-stock behavior in their marketing materials. So they kind of can't. It's the thing where they're trying to have it both ways to some degree. Like the lower power spec is obviously the way that they would ideally want to run the CPUs, because it uses less power, so that would benefit power charts. It's more stable. They can get more CPUs running at lower power specs, so that potentially there's more silicon they could sell at various different product names. But the performance that you get in that base spec, of the Intel official spec range, the base limit, is not particularly competitive on performance. So then they have to create this whole other spec, which is the high power spec, the PL1 equals PL2. And, you suddenly now have a range of things that could possibly be the case. And then on top of that, you have motherboard manufacturers who, whether or not Intel is happy with that behavior or not, are enabling things like MC out of the box or other non-default specs. But we could even sit here saying, like, running MC is not a default behavior, but is that accurate? Like, is Intel saying that that's not officially supported, or is it officially supported? Because the motherboards and the CPUs are kind of all part of an ecosystem. Is Intel aware that ASUS are running MCE and are not happy with it, but ASUS are going against their will? Or is Intel being like, that's okay, like, yes, you can run MC enabled by default out of the box, and we're happy with that. It's not official, but we're not going to tell you to run at a different spec. And I think ultimately both parties have to take some responsibility. Intel has to be looking at what a motherboard manufacturer is doing, and are those boards being run at settings that we're comfortable with? Otherwise, our CPUs could be blown up. And motherboard manufacturers also need to acknowledge that they can't just enable ridiculous specifications out of the box that blow up CPUs. Like, both brands have to be working together to make sure that everything works properly. So I've seen a lot of comments being like, this is definitely the motherboard manufacturers like ASUS enabling these features out of the box, or this is definitely Intel for having these CPUs consume too much power. But it's a platform. Everyone has to be contributing in the best possible way. So yeah, I imagine that once Intel comes out with their investigation, it's not going to be like, ASUS, 100%, it's on you guys. Like, maybe they'll throw an AIB under the bus like that, but I think there's a lot of things that will probably end up being contributing factors.
Yeah, and there's a lot of things that need to be fixed with these platforms, and more recently we've found the same problem with AMD platforms. But we've come across so many instances in the past where, although motherboards claim compatibility with Core i9 parts and Core i7, but usually it's the Core i9s that present these problems, they don't really support them, not properly. They're power limited. The VRAMs run way too hot because they can't deliver the amount of power that the CPU requires to run at the required, the standard performance, essentially stock performance, stock clocks. And with 1400Ks, 1300Ks, and even the 1200K really started to present this problem because they are quite power hungry. So, if you buy an LJ, if you can basically buy any LJ 1700 motherboard, whether it be from ASUS, ASRock, MSI, Gigabyte, they will all claim support for the 14900K. But there's an alarming amount of those boards that if you run the 1400K in an all-core workload for more than about 2 minutes, you'll start to see throttling and all kinds of things take place that shouldn't, and they can cause stability problems. They certainly cause a reduction in performance. We've shown up to 60% loss in performance, which is mind-blowing.
That should not be allowed.
That should not be a thing, but those boards claim to support a 14900K. And whether or not you would put a 1400K on those boards, like a lot of people say, well, you wouldn't put that CPU on a $100 board. It's like, well, in a way, fair enough, but why are you making that argument? Because the board claims to be able to do it. That's the bigger problem, right? And that was the problem we saw with the B650 motherboards. People were saying you wouldn't put a Ryzen 9 part on a cheap entry-level B650 board, despite the fact that we know for a fact people do that. And a lot of those boards are designed with that intention. So the ASRock H board, the B650M-H, is designed for OEM use. And we know that OEMs love to sell you high-end CPUs on crap motherboards. So they're actually making them for that purpose, but people just are none the wiser. They don't know they're losing 20-30% of performance. They just know they've got a Ryzen 9. That's a good CPU. So that's another problem that we've been trying to sort of expose and show for years now. But yeah, Intel's platforms are definitely much more of a mess than AMD's when it comes to power, simply because they use more of it. But it's also an AMD problem. And as I mentioned, we've seen problems with AMD and the board makers and stuff like that just recently with AM5.
Yep.
If AMD's Radeon division doesn't release an X900 series card, like it's being rumored, does that essentially guarantee Blackwell will come out being way overpriced, since there won't be any real competition?
I mean, from one perspective, yes, because there'll be less competition, and we have seen with even this current generation that NVIDIA has responded a bit to AMD's moves with Radeon products. I'm thinking of the RTX 4070 is probably one example where they did make the official drop to $550 when they brought out the super model at the same price, and they probably couldn't have those two cards at the same price. But even before that happened, they were reducing the price of that model when the 7800 XT came out and reduced it further below $550 even as more GPUs launched, the GRA model, all that sort of thing. So they do pay attention. It's not like NVIDIA's sitting around not caring about what AMD does. They pay attention. However, they also have to compete with themselves, largely because GeForce is the dominant brand. Most people who are buying GeForce GPUs are upgrading from a GeForce GPU and are not considering Radeon cards. Now, probably a lot of hardware Unboxed viewers are sitting there saying, that's a weird opinion to have. I try and consider all the products. But you look at the general market, and definitely there's people who only consider GeForce. So if the products are really badly priced compared to previous generation cards, and there's no incentive for someone to upgrade from a 20 series or 30 series product, no one will be buying the cards. So they still do have to compete with themselves to some degree, and that limits the ridiculousness to the pricing structure that they can go with. And I personally think that if they went with continuing to just price them the same price to performance ratio, which means any faster cards were even more expensive, that is just not going to work. If someone's saying they've bought a 20 series or 30 series card and they say, to get double the performance, I need to spend double the money, the interest isn't going to be there. They're going to turn to the used market or just continue to buy lower and lower tier cards, which is not what NVIDIA wants, or potentially go to competitors. So we'll see what they do, but I think we've talked about in previous Q&As that we're not expecting pricing to be as bad as it has been this past generation. But don't clip this and make it like a big thing when it doesn't happen, because I'm not saying it will happen for sure, but yeah,
we're hoping.
We're hoping for sure.
All right, Tim, if you could change one thing about how YouTube works, what would you change? Mine off the top of my head would be like being able to call a GeForce RTX 4080 review a GeForce RTX 4080 review, and then just have a picture of the GeForce RTX 4080 in the thumbnail, sort of like how we used to do it with tech sites and stuff. But that's not really a YouTube thing. That's a YouTube user thing. Like, people complain about clickbait and faces in thumbnails and all that dumb stuff that we don't particularly love, but it's like, you have to play the game or you die, and then no one watches your content. So, and that it's not that
YouTube doesn't encourage you to make those titles.
The YouTube algorithm isn't some sort of AI bot thing that's sitting.
It's not reading your title and being like, that's a bad title.
Yeah. And it's not like, I love dumb faces, all the dumb faces, or I'm not promoting your video. It's actually based on user habits. So all YouTube is taking essentially your data. They're not stealing your data, but your user habits. They're recording to create a data log. And then they're like, so this person liked this thumbnail and clicked on it. So the click-through rate on that video is really high. So that we're going to tell the person that made that video that dumb face good, that worked well. And then they watched quite a bit of the video, and these were the parts they really fixated on and watched. And here are the parts they didn't care for. So optimize that as you see fit. And the same thing with titles. We can mess around with titles, and they'll be giving us real-time data on which titles are giving us the best results. And collectively, YouTubers have worked out what titles and thumbnails work. So, a rant there that doesn't exactly address the question. I've actually not even addressed the question. I've said something that I would like to change that isn't really...
Yes, it's sort of more like change as part of being a YouTuber.
Yeah,
and having to use
about using YouTube.
Yeah, I think YouTube. I'd like to see less of a focus on shorts, as maybe a creator that doesn't create a lot of shorts or really any shorts is, YouTube as a platform. I think its real strength is the longer form content, and that has always been. It's what's made YouTube successful. It's what remains highly successful on YouTube. It's what I think most people, according to YouTube, they claim that most people also watch shorts in addition to long form content. I'll take their word on that one, sure. But realistically speaking, most of the content, most of the money on the platform, because we know based on how they distribute money based on shorts versus longer form content, most of the money is also in the longer form content, that I would like to see YouTube acknowledge more what has made YouTube successful. I think there was a period there on YouTube where they were really keen on like creating original shows and like even getting on board like talk shows and stuff to post their content on YouTube. They were steering away from user generated content into more like, how do we get mainstream people to post on YouTube to boost views? But I've always thought that what's made YouTube great are independent original creators who are using the platform and creating really interesting things. And almost all of the best content on YouTube are from those sorts of creators. So I think if they've done this big thing of promoting shorts a lot and being like, please watch shorts, please create shorts in a little YouTube studio. How many times do we see little messages being like, you haven't made shorts. Have you thought of making shorts? And I remember even just emailing like a YouTube creator liaison person. And almost every time it's like an idea for growth or whatever is like making shorts, which I don't know if that's effective or not. But yeah, like shorts are awesome for TikTok. They're awesome for Instagram stories. They're awesome for those platforms that are designed around short form content. I'm yet to be convinced that YouTube is designed and is best when showing short form content. That's not to say there's not good shorts being made on the platform. I've seen a few that I think are pretty good, but I still believe that YouTube's main strength and what should be focused on the most is long form content. So maybe I'm an old school old man now, where I'm
welcome to the club.
Get the short form stuff, concede that to TikTok, which is maybe a terrible business move. I don't know. I don't care. YouTube should be the short form. YouTube should be the long form platform for original independent creators. I think that's where that made YouTube what it is.
And that's your short form take on the situation.
It's my short form take. Would that even fit into a short? Probably not. When a game doesn't run at your preferred frame rates, in what order do you reduce resolution, turn down settings, use upscaling? Which gives the biggest performance boost for the lowest loss in visuals? Is upscaling better than reducing resolution, i.e. would you rather run 4K with performance upscaling or 1080p native? So, yeah, I mean, immediately I would just not run at a lower resolution on a display. I think it looks trash. So if you had a 4K display, definitely I would never recommend running games at native 1080p or 1440p. It's not going to look good, just simply because you can't scale those things onto monitors as well. So it's always got to be reduced resolution is like the very last thing that you would ever consider doing, because it'll just make the game look really blurry.
Unless the monitor has a native 1080p mode. Because I watched a recent Monitors Unboxed
Even then,
review.
that mode does not it looks fine for competitive gaming, but if you're playing like a visual game where you're concerned about quality settings, making it look nice with the performance, you'd be wanting to run that on the 4K mode as much as possible. The 1080p mode is very much for like your competitive gameplay where you turn everything down and you want the best frame rate.
Sure.
So as far as like the main things I'd be considering between turning down settings and using upscaling, like it really depends on the resolution of your display for starters, because upscaling is much more effective at 4K than it is at 1080p. So like 4K performance mode probably looks better than 1080p with quality upscaling. So you kind of have to factor that in. And then with settings, that can depend on the game. Some settings you can get a very large performance benefit from turning ultra to high with very little performance and very little quality loss, which means that for like upscaling, you might see more visual artifacts from using upscaling versus just turning ultra to high. So generally, I'd say based on the games that I've looked at, that you'd want to turn from ultra to high first before using upscaling. I think a lot of the reduction in things like volumetric fog, shadow resolution can be very difficult to notice. So if I'm thinking of like a Cyberpunk, for example, and you're not factoring in the ray trace settings, turning from ultra to high is a very easy way to gain performance. Then I'd probably start thinking about upscaling to some degree before going to like medium or low settings, because often those can start much more noticeably dropping those features. So yeah, that's sort of the order I'd think about. But again, it would depend on the resolution. If I'm playing at 1080p, I'd be much more keen on dropping from ultra to medium rather than using upscaling. And it can depend on the upscaling technology as well. Maybe if you had DLSS available to you, you'd choose that first. But if you were on an AMD GPU, maybe you prefer medium settings with no FSR versus ultra with FSR. And again, it depends heavily on the resolution. And that's why we've had to make so many videos talking about upscaling technologies in all sorts of different configurations in all sorts of different games, because what you find at 4K using certain modes absolutely does not apply at 1080p and lower resolutions. So it's a really complicated discussion, and I can't just sit here and say, yeah, this is my order in every situation. That said, I would always put lowering the resolution of the game last. That's a pretty safe bet.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that answer, so that's what I would have said as well. And that... You laugh at...
It's a very forceful and. You're like, and now, right?
And I am here to declare this is the end of the Q&A series. Please, Tim, in future, when I do my ands, take me seriously.
Yeah, it's hard a lot of the time.
I don't know why I pay for these insults.
Yeah.
But for whatever reason I do. I don't know. I guess he tests monitors fairly well. So, there's that. What were we here again for? You've thrown me off.
I think we're ending the video.
Yeah, we're ending
but we're
the video.
extending it out for watch time reasons.
Yeah, let's try and make this like half an hour. That's the goal. Nobody watches this anyway. We could honestly just talk about anything, say anything.
That's right.
Did your footy team win on the weekend?
Let's not talk about that.
No, they got smashed, didn't they?
They didn't get smashed. They lost narrowly to a very bad team.
Who'd they play again?
Essendon. They're not great.
Oh yeah, Essendon played pretty well actually.
Yeah, Adelaide did not.
Yeah, my team didn't play, so I've got no football or AFL, Australian Football League, news for you. So
yep,
that's disappointing. I mean, they play this Wednesday against Balin's team, our video editor Richmond. So actually, this video will be released after that. So
they're playing on a Wednesday. Oh, because it's Antec.
Yeah, so if you go to afl.com.au, you'll be able to find out the Melbourne Demons versus the Richmond Tigers. And you'll hopefully find out that my team won. And then you'll be like, ha, Balin in the comments. He'll be very upset.
If Melbourne don't beat Richmond, something will be wrong, because that would be a massive upset if it was the other way around. It'd be terrible. But Adelaide plays North Melbourne. And if they can't beat North Melbourne, who, for people who have no idea about AFL,
we're going to explain it. Go back to the start.
They're a terrible team that has won very few games in the last 5 years. They are winless on the bottom of the ladder by a mile. They just got smashed by the second last team on the ladder.
Yeah, Hawthorn wrecked them.
There is no way any team should be losing to them this year. If Adelaide, I will stop supporting Adelaide if they lose to North. I probably won't do that.
Oh no, we're holding you to that. I'm
backtracking.
So if they lose, you're gonna become a Melbourne supporter?
No, I won't be a Melbourne supporter.
Oh, you will. All right,
No. I would consider stopping following the football, because that would be the biggest upset ever.
I hope Tex Walker watches the Q&A series, because he's going to be spitting chips at you.
Well, he could probably get support from better people than me, maybe.
What were we doing here again?
This is not AFL related. We usually keep our AFL stuff for the podcast.
Yeah, watch the Harbour Unboxed podcast that we talk about our boring lives.
And that includes the football.
Yeah, it does include
and also,
football.
This episode could be released well after that game was played too.
I think it'll be at least 2 or 3 days after.
Yeah.
So that's good. So
people will know whether I need to disown the football entirely, or whether the bare minimum will happen, which is Adelaide beating North.
Cool. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you again next time. I'm your host, Steve.
I'm your host, Tim.
Bye.
Bye. See you later.
See ya.